Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into really one of the most defining periods in American history. We're talking about the huge debate over American imperialism, right around the turn of the 20th century. And for you, the listener, this is really about getting to grips with this fundamental clash over what America should be. Our mission today, pretty straightforward. We're
Yeah.
using the sources you shared to lay out the main arguments. What were the similarities, the differences, and how people saw America's role in the world? Was it destined to become this global empire, or should it stick closer to its roots, more isolationist?
Yeah, that tension just defines the 1890s. You've got the imperialists on one side saying, look, America's a powerhouse. We're destined to spread our culture, our institutions. And they pointed to economics, race, competition with Europe.
All the big drivers.
Right. But then the anti-imperialists, they completely rejected that. They brought up founding principles, self-determination, Washington's warnings. They argued that grabbing overseas territory, that just went against everything America was supposed to stand for. It was fundamental.
Let's start with maybe the most tangible part.
Yeah.
Economics. You really can't talk imperialism without the factories and farms. A huge driver, maybe the main one the sources highlight, was this weird problem of being too successful.
Yeah.
Industrial, agricultural, overproduction.
Exactly.
American industry and farms were just churning out so much stuff.
Yeah.
Way more than people here could buy. And if you didn't find somewhere else for all that surplus to go, well, the whole economy was looking shaky. So it wasn't just like greed for profit. It felt like economic survival.
That's it, precisely. And survival meant needing two things from overseas: places to sell the goods and access to raw materials, which is why, even acquisitions that seemed odd at first suddenly made sense. Remember Alaska? People called it Seward's Folly back in 1867. Just ice, right? But then gold was discovered. And suddenly, getting resource-rich land looked pretty smart.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting for me, because it wasn't always the government leading the charge, was it? The sources talk a lot about economic imperialism, like control through money, not just flags and soldiers. Can you maybe unpack that with someone like Minor Keith?
Oh, Minor Keith is the perfect case study, founder of the United Fruit Company. Now, the U.S. government wasn't planting flags all over Costa Rica, right? But Keith's company, it basically ran the country's economy, land, railroads, even politics. He built this private banana empire. It showed how American businesses could get that imperial power, real economic control, without needing the government to formally annex territory or build military bases everywhere.
Right. Control without the direct cost and hassle of, say, a coaling station. So if the economic push was urgent, the strategic argument felt almost existential. It wasn't just, this would be nice. It was framed as, we need this for national security, for our place in the world, especially when that internal frontier vanished.
Exactly right. The big moment there was the 1890 census. It officially declared the western frontier closed. And you had historian Frederick Jackson Turner arguing that westward expansion, that constant movement, was like core to the American identity. It kept democracy fresh. So if the frontier at home is gone, well, the imperialists argued America needed new frontiers overseas to keep that energy, that competitive spirit alive.
And the competition was fierce.
Oh, yeah, fierce.
You had expansionists constantly warning, look, if we sit back, Britain, France, Germany, they'll carve up the world. And America will be stuck as a second-rate power.
That was the fear. And that fear is what really powered the push for a stronger Navy. You absolutely have to talk about Alfred Thayer Mahan here. His book from 1890, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. It was a sensation. Mahan's point was stark, but simple. If you want global power, you need sea power. A powerful Navy.
Makes sense. Control the seas, control the trade routes.
Precisely. And his ideas had a direct impact. Congress starts funding this modern steel fleet, and crucially, Mahan stressed the need for overseas bases, coaling stations, places in the Pacific, the Caribbean, because you can have the best ships, but if they can't refuel, resupply, get repaired, far from home. You can't project power effectively. Strategy and economics just merged.
Okay, so we have the money, the markets, the ships, the bases. Let's shift gears a bit from, profits and ports to philosophy, morality. Because this whole expansion thing, it wasn't just sold as practical. It was wrapped up in ideas about duty, race, even God.
It absolutely was.
The kind of intellectual framework often cited was social Darwinism, right?
Yeah, that was definitely in the mix. This pretty brutal idea, taking Darwin's survival of the fittest and applying it to nations. The thinking went, strong nations are supposed to dominate weaker ones. It's just the natural order of things.
Wow. And how did race play into that? Because it seems like it got tied up with racial theories very quickly.
Very quickly. Josiah Strong is a key figure here. He was a Protestant minister, wrote a really influential book in 1885 called Our Country. Strong didn't just say expand. He argued that the Anglo-Saxon race was basically the peak of human evolution, and because of that, Anglo-Saxons had this divine duty, God's plan, essentially to expand their supposedly superior institutions and values across the globe.
A divine duty. That leads straight into that infamous phrase, the white man's burden, doesn't it?
It does. This self-proclaimed obligation. America, or the white race more broadly, had this solemn duty to go out and civilize other peoples. Lift them up, whether they wanted lifting or not. It wasn't just about selling them things. It was about fundamentally changing them, often through force.
And politicians like Albert Beveridge really hammered this home, linking faith and national destiny.
Oh, absolutely. Beveridge was a powerful voice for this. He framed expansion almost as a holy crusade. Conquering territory wasn't just good strategy or economics, it was fulfilling a Christian mission, spreading civilization, spreading the faith. So you see how it all comes together. Economic need gets fused with this sense of racial superiority and a divine mission. It's a powerful and frankly dangerous combination.
It really is. And that very moral certainty, that perceived hypocrisy, is exactly what fueled the opposition, right? The Anti-Imperialist League pops up in 1898. A real mix of people united against taking places like the Philippines, and they went right back to America's own founding documents.
They did. Their central argument was deeply moral and deeply American, in a sense, they asked. How can a nation born from a fight for self-determination turn around and deny that exact right to other people, to rule colonies without the consent of the governed? They said that was just a flat-out betrayal of the American Revolution's ideals. Hypocrisy, pure and simple.
And you had some big names pointing this out. Mark Twain, for instance.
Yeah, Twain was incredibly sharp and scathing about it. He used his fame to just relentlessly expose the contradiction, spreading civilization with bullets and bayonets. He saw the dark irony, the violence masked by noble language.
The anti-imperialists also worried about getting tangled up in foreign problems, didn't they? Harking back to Washington.
Constantly. They kept bringing up George Washington's farewell address, the warning against entangling alliances. They saw overseas territories not as assets, but as dangerous liabilities. Things that would inevitably suck the U.S. into distant wars, into complex global politics that, they argued, didn't really serve America's core interests. Stick to home, fix our own problems.
So maintain tradition, uphold principles. But this wasn't just a moral debate. It blew up into a huge constitutional fight, too.
Oh, absolutely huge. And this often gets a bit lost, but it was critical legally. The big question became, does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, if the U.S. takes over, say, the Philippines or Puerto Rico, do the people living there automatically get all the rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution?
Like citizenship,
Yeah.
trial by jury, freedom of speech.
Exactly. All of it. And interestingly, many anti-imperialists insisted the answer had to be yes.
Why? If they were against annexation anyway.
Well, it was a strategic argument, really. They argued the Constitution must apply fully, precisely because they suspected the imperialists didn't want it to. They knew the government wasn't planning to grant Filipinos full citizenship and rights overnight, so by insisting the Constitution did follow the flag, they forced the imperialists to either admit they were creating second-class subjects, betraying American values, or face the immense practical difficulty of actually applying the Constitution fully in distant, diverse colonies. It highlighted the hypocrisy, and they worried, if you start denying rights over there, what stops that erosion of rights from creeping back home?
That's a really important point. And then there's the other side of the coin, though, racial arguments used by some anti-imperialists.
Right, this is a crucial and maybe uncomfortable aspect. Not all anti-imperialists were motivated purely by high-minded principle. Some opposed annexation, especially of places like the Philippines with large non-white populations, because they feared it would dilute America's perceived cultural and racial purity. They wanted America to remain predominantly white and Anglo-Saxon. So for them, expansion wasn't just bad policy, it was a threat to the nation's racial makeup. It was an isolationist kind of racism, in stark contrast to the expansionist racism of someone like Strong.
So you had this really strange mix of opponents, people coming at it from totally different angles.
A really diverse coalition. You had Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in the world, a huge industrialist. He thought imperialism was immoral, bad for business in the long run, and he actually offered $20 million his own money to buy independence for the Philippines.
Wow. And then intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes, Du Bois saw imperialism through the lens of race from a completely different perspective. He argued that dominating people of color abroad was just an extension, a continuation of the racial oppression and segregation happening right here in the United States. It was part of the same global system of white supremacy.
And we absolutely have to mention the voices of those directly affected. People like Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii.
Definitely. Her story is so important. She represents the indigenous resistance, the people whose lands and sovereignty were being taken. Her steadfast opposition to the American-backed coup that overthrew her government is this powerful reminder that the people being civilized or annexed had their own leaders, their own societies, their own desires for self-determination. They weren't just passive bystanders.
So when you zoom out, what was this fight really about?
I think connecting it all, it was fundamentally a battle for America's soul. That sounds dramatic, but it kind of was. On one side, you had this powerful mix of, economic necessity or perceived necessity, this desperate need for markets, plus strategic anxiety, this fear of falling behind European rivals. And on the other side, you had appeals to America's founding ideals, democratic principles, moral consistency, plus that strong traditional desire to stay out of foreign messes, that isolationist streak. America was wrestling with itself. Did its success require it to become a global empire, imposing its will? Or did its ideals demand it focus inward, perfecting democracy at home?
Right. So for you listening, what's the takeaway here? We've walked through how both sides marshaled arguments about everything, money, morals, strategy, even these really conflicting ideas about race, to argue for what America should be on the world stage. Was global leadership the goal, or was it perfecting the Union at home first? That was the core tension. And think back to Minor Keith and the United Fruit Company, that idea of economic power shaping another country's destiny without formal annexation. Here's something to maybe chew on. Think about today. When you see giant multinational corporations expanding globally, maybe seeking new digital markets, maybe seeking access to critical minerals or cheap labor. Is that in a way a modern version of economic imperialism, even if there aren't warships and coaling stations involved in the same way? Does that kind of influence echo the debates from over a century ago? Just something to mull over.